We are Plum Creek, and we're a place where you matter. Our mission here is centered around change lives, changing lives. We believe this happens through 3 relationships: intimacy with God, intentionality with family, and influence with others. We hope what you hear today will impact and challenge you to love God and the people around you in a whole new way. We'd encourage you to connect with us online at plumcreekonline.com or on social media to see how Plum Creek is impacting our community and what opportunities we have for you and your family to get connected. If you'd like to support the ministry we're doing here in Castle Rock, the 2 easiest ways are through the Give tab on our website or via your mobile device by texting your dollar amount to the number on the screen. Thanks again for joining us today. We hope you'll enjoy this message.
Hello, is it me you're looking for? I can see it in your eyes, the light, the heat, and complete. Your eyes, see the doorway. The only one for me is you, and you for me, so happy together.
Well, Plum Creek, it's always amazing coming here. And I love coming to this community and being down here. And every single time I walk through the doors to come here when the team invites me to come be with you, I'm absolutely amazed at the miracles of God. And I want you to know that you sitting in this room, you sitting in this seat, you represent the miracle of God. I remember specifically years ago when Doug and I were pastoring together up in Fort Collins. And I remember walking, there was a Subway right down the road from the church. And I was walking the Subway, and Doug was driving into the parking lot, and he rolled his window down, and we were talking, and he said, I'm gonna plant a church. And I said, great, that's awesome. Where? And he said, Castle Rock. And I said, awesome, where's Castle Rock? And he told me, and then a few weeks later, he called me into his office, showed me the map of Castle Rock that him and Beth had been praying over, and he showed me the street called Plum Creek, and he said, we're gonna be called Plum Creek Church. And so I walk into this place seeing the miracle of what God does, and it's absolutely beautiful, and you're a part of that. You know, when Doug called me a few weeks ago, and he said, Reza, this is what we're tackling. We're gonna be tackling this idea of sexuality and relationships and marriage and desires and those passions that we have in our life. And he called me and said, would you come be a part of one of our weekends? And I'd say, I am absolutely thrilled to do that. And I'm thrilled on a couple levels. One, because our culture will never hold back when it tries to shape our minds or our thoughts on what relationships are supposed to look like. Our culture will never hold back on what sex is supposed to be, what is attractive, what isn't attractive. But our culture never holds back, not just to adults, but even to our children. Our culture will not hold back. But so many times in our churches, we hold back because we think it's a little bit awkward to talk about it when everyone's in attendance. And I'm so thrilled that you all have pastors that are brave enough to say that we're going to teach the whole gospel, that we're going to talk about these issues that go deep to the soul of who we are. And so parents, I want to be very clear, and I know last week Gary did this as well. We're going to be talking about some sensitive issues. We're going to be talking about the idea of relationships and sexuality, and what does God have to say about it. So we fully trust you as parents to make that decision if you want your children to stay or not stay, but we'd love for everyone to be here because we believe this is the Word of God that is living and active. And these words that are written are not just words written on a page of somebody who lived a long time ago, but these are the active and living words of God that have endured through all the centuries, through thousands of years, and that will continue to endure for centuries and thousands upon thousands of years in all of eternity. So I'm thrilled to come and talk about this key issue that impacts every single one of us. Whether we think it's awkward or not awkward, we are sexual beings. That is how God designed us, and we're going to take a look at it and see it is a good thing that God created us this way. The other reason I'm thrilled to talk about is for many years when I was pastoring with Doug, I was a college and young adults pastor at the church where Doug was a men's pastor at, and I myself was single for a lot of the years. Actually, all the years that Doug and Beth were in Fort Collins with us, that I got to pastor with them, I was single. It wasn't until they came down here to Castle Rock that my wife and I had met, and he got to come up and be a part of our wedding and watch our wedding. And it was just amazing for him to be there because he walked me through so many of those years. So it's an honor and it's a thrill to be able to be here with you, Plum Creek, to talk about these core issues of our identity. And not just our identity as men or identity as women, not just our identity of someone who is single or someone that's married, but our identity as people and individuals who've been created in the image of a living God. And we've been created in the image of a God who at his core is relational. That we serve a God that theologians like to call a triune God. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. That's a fancy word for the Trinity, is a triune God. That from the very beginning of time, God has been in perfect relationship, the Father in relationship with the Son in relationship with the Holy Spirit, all being in relationship with each other. And we've been created in that image. And if we've been created in that image, if that's the imprint that is on us, then it's no wonder we crave intimacy. It's no wonder we crave relationship. We're designed for relationship and for intimacy. And to celebrate this, God instituted this thing called marriage. And so we're going to dive in and figure out, what does it look like? What does the scripture specifically say about marriage? What does it say about our passions, our desires, sexuality, relationships, dating? How do we flesh this out, whether we're married or whether we're in a season of singleness? And so I'm thrilled that we get to come around the scriptures and to hear what God has to say about it. Because again, our culture will shape us and tell us what we're supposed to think. But yet God designed us in a specific way. So that's where we're going this morning. If you have a Bible, you can turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. That's where we're going. And before we dive into this, as talking about weddings, being a college pastor, young adult pastor, working with athletes now, primarily college and young athletes, professional athletes that are younger, I get to be a part of a lot of wedding ceremonies. I've been a part of some beautiful, amazing, wonderful wedding ceremonies. I've been a part of some horrific wedding ceremonies. I have seen brides and their moms about 10 minutes before the wedding starts about to scratch each other's eyes out. I've seen grooms show up late. I've seen grooms not show up. I've seen people fighting. One day I will write an anonymous book from the wedding officiant. So if you ever see that, that was me. Just don't tell anybody. One wedding in particular stands out to me. It was this beautiful wedding of this couple who met in our young adult ministry, and they both started following Jesus, were passionately after Jesus, and they kind of had built their relationship around this one verse. They had a relationship verse. And let me tell you this, my wife and I guess we're not that spiritual. We don't have a relationship verse, but they did, and it was wonderful, and it's awesome, and it's this beautiful passage in 1 John chapter 4, verse 18. And if you're familiar with it, or if you're not, it's going to be up on the screen. 1 John 4:18, it's a beautiful verse to base a relationship and a marriage on. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. Because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. Everyone say, ah. Isn't that a beautiful verse as you think about a couple, a young man and a young woman starting off, wanting to start their life together? This is the verse that they wanted their marriage to be based upon. And it was so important to them, the bride wanted the cake to read 1 John 4:18. There was this so they went to the baker. The baker said, that's easy, we can do that. We have this 3 or 4 tier cake, and we'll put the man and the woman on top and the dolls on top, and we'll have 1 John 4:18 on the side. So we go to Estes Park. It was a beautiful outdoor wedding in the mountains. in Estes, and we go into the reception hall, beautifully decorated, and right at the centerpiece was this beautiful cake. But on it, it said John 4:18. The baker, I guess, didn't think the 1 was that important for 1 John 4:18, which you think to yourself, well, this is the living word of God. How bad could any verse be? Like, it could be good. The problem is John 4:18 is Jesus talking to a woman at the well, and Jesus says this: the fact is you've had 5 husbands. And the man you have now is not your husband. What you have just said is true, which is a very awkward verse when you think about starting and celebrating your young marriage. You see, here Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Gary gave some great context last week about it. What is happening here is the Corinthian people were really confused about sex. They were incredibly confused about marriage and issues in marriage and relationship. And one of the things that caused a lot of confusion was their culture, kind of like today. You see, in their culture, there was a temple in Corinth to the Greek goddess Artemis, who is the goddess of love. And so there would be people that would go to this temple to worship the Greek goddess, and they would worship in a really peculiar way because they would have literally hundreds of temple prostitutes that would be walking around the temple, and that's how people would go in and they'd pay the prostitute, and that's how they would, quote unquote, worship in this temple. And so the people that were at the time trying to follow Jesus were incredibly confused, saying, well, if that's worship, are we supposed to do that? And if that's what they do, maybe we're supposed to completely stay away from sex because sex is a bad thing. So they actually wrote a list of questions to Paul. Paul had planted the church. So they wrote a list of questions to Paul, and he addresses those questions in his letter back to them. So that's why we have the letter of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. Paul is addressing a lot of these questions. So specifically in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, if you have a Bible, turn to it. Or if you have a device, please turn to it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he goes on. Now, we're only going to talk about 2 verses, verse 8 and verse 9. It doesn't mean you're going to get out of church any earlier, but we're going to talk about 2 verses. So in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 8, Paul is speaking specifically to a population of people. And he's talking to a population of people that have basically become a part of this population in 2 different ways. He's talking to singles, people that are unmarried. He's talking to them specifically, but he's talking to them either they have never been married, or he uses the term widows, which literally means if you are somebody who had been married and for whatever reason, whatever circumstances happen, you are now not married. And so Paul is speaking specifically to singles. And yet, as we craft this, the conversation that we're having is directed towards singles. If you are married, I am so thrilled that you are here because the principles we're going to talk about come from the living word of God that speak to us no matter the circumstance we're in. And so I'm glad that we're here taking a look at this. So he's speaking specifically to singles, and this is what he says. Now, to the unmarried and the widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. So Paul is literally saying, look, I'm going to give you this conversation. I'm going to give you this advice. I'm going to give you these principles as somebody who is experiencing exactly what you're experiencing. We know that Paul was not married, and so he was a single. We don't know all the circumstances around it, but we can presume that he was never married, but we don't know. All we know is he does not have a spouse. So he's talking from personal experience, which is always good to hear from someone who has personal experience rather than somebody who gives theoretical advice. So Paul says, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. But, there's a transition there. If they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. You see, as Paul is talking to singles, he's saying, look, it's good for them not to marry and to stay single as I am. You know what Paul is doing? He is absolutely affirming the season of singleness. He's affirming this idea, saying it is possible to be successfully single. Paul himself was single, and he was incredibly successful in doing what God had called him specifically to do. And then verse 7, and chapter 7, verse 9, he comes back and he says, but, however, if you cannot control yourselves, it is better for you to marry than to burn with passion. And it's interesting that he uses this term burn, and that's what we're going to talk about. What does it mean to burn with passion? What does that mean about our sexual lives? What does that mean about our relationship, about our marriages, about the intimacy that we crave? Because in a lot of ways, singleness can feel like there's something burning inside of us. And not just burning in our pocket, but almost just burning in our souls. It's like this desire that I just can't get to. For some reason, there's a block. And it's not just a burning in our soul, there's almost like a literal physical burning in our stomach. And that burning grows bigger and bigger and bigger, and we're in inner turmoil because of this specific season that we're in. What do we do with our lifelong desires and dreams if we're single? But I also want to say, what do we do with those lifelong desires and dreams and passion if we're married and we don't sense that passion, or we've lost that passion, or something has happened to interrupt that passion? How do we view our relationships in this idea that God created sexuality and intimacy for a good thing? And so that's where we're going to come from a whole bunch of different angles. So one of the angles we're going to come at is I want to be very clear in talking about oversimplified struggles. You see, I could say this. Sometimes married people, we say some really dumb and stupid things to single people. Sometimes we just flat give bad advice. In an effort to try to make people feel better, we will say things or use phrases that are actually more damaging than they are helpful. And it's because we want to help people feel better. And so sometimes we say things. One of the things we say is, look, just make sure you don't settle and you can't settle. But oh yeah, at the same time, don't you dare sin. So don't settle, but don't sin. Don't settle, but don't sin. And everything we say usually surrounds those two conversations. Don't settle and don't sin. But those that are single will say, okay, great, you're confused. Okay, I won't settle, but I won't sin. I won't settle, but I won't sin. But what do I do with this passion and this longing and this burning that I have inside of me? And on the surface, it seems like Paul is doing this exact thing. Paul actually makes it sound really easy. He's like, oh yeah, hey, by the way, if you're unmarried and you can't control yourself, just go ahead and get married. It's better to marry than to burn with passion. It's like, he makes it sound so simple. Like we can literally just go online and buy ourselves a spouse and say, hey, I'm gonna, go purchase a spouse or whatever it might be. It's like, he makes it sound like bread. Like, hey, I'm out of bread. If you're out of bread, go to the store, buy some bread and you'll be full. It's not that easy, Paul. What do I do in this season where I'm looking and I can't and it won't and I don't think it'll ever be? Or my marriage is in this place and I don't think it's gonna get to this place. The worst thing we can do is give oversimplified answers to these struggles. And I think a part of this is, I'm not sure we fully understand the depth of what Paul experienced. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 29, Paul is talking about all the struggles and all the things and all the realities that he is facing as a single person in ministry, doing what God has called him to do. And in chapter 11, verse 29, he literally starts talking. And in this verse, it's going to say up here on the screens, he's going to say, look, I have gone through all the things that you have gone through. I've experienced these things. Let's look at this verse right now on the screen. He says, who is weak and I do not feel weak? Who is led into sin and I do not inwardly burn? Paul uses that exact same word, burn. Paul absolutely understands what it's like to burn with passion, to burn with temptation, to burn with evil all around us and these things, these longings that we have. He's a part of the struggle. And so that struggle is internal. But I'll also say that struggle is cultural. Because just like in the Corinthian culture where things were a little bit confused, we can make things very confusing when it comes to sexuality and marriage and dating and relationships. You see, one of the false teachings that's out there is that you have to be married to be complete. That unless you're married, you, for whatever reason, your life is if you're not married, your life is incomplete. Can I tell you this? There's not one person in this room, no matter the stage of life you're in, that is incomplete in the eyes of God. There is not one person here right now that does not have everything they need for life and godliness, for the purposes for which God placed you on this earth. And that is not dependent upon your relationship with the spouse. It's completely dependent on your reality that God has invited us into a relationship because we are complete in him, because he created us in his image. You know, one of the other cultural things that we have that kind of gets us confused is this idea that there is the one for us to marry. Like, I would ask you to raise your hands. How many believe that there's like the one to marry? But I don't want to do that because I don't want to just point out how you're going to be wrong. Because just think with me for a moment. Nowhere in Scripture does it even come close to talking about the one for you to marry, that there's one person out of the billions of people in this earth, that there's one person. And we don't even need the Bible to think about that. We can just think logically. Like, just go with me here. If there was the one for us to marry, and you end up not marrying that one, you marry somebody else, and let's say you're a man and you marry a woman, and you get together and you have a baby. Well, that baby's not going to have a one because that baby wasn't even supposed to be in existence, because you were supposed to marry Jennifer and you ended up marrying Michelle, and you and Michelle had a baby named Michael, but you were never supposed to have a Michael. You were supposed to have a Sally, and now Michael and Sally and all these people, and now there's going to be people who don't have another one because you never got with the right one. You see, that's false. Disney created the one. The Bachelor creates this idea that there's one person out there for every single one of us. See, all the emphasis on dating and marriage in our culture is about finding the right one. But all of the emphasis on dating and sex and marriage in the Bible is about being the right one. You see, when we focus on being the right one, God will put us in the right places. And so I don't want to oversimplify the struggle. There's people in this room that are going through some incredible turmoil because of this relationship in these marriage issues. I don't want to oversimplify it, because it's a complex issue. But I do want us to have a conversation and think about, what do we do with these passions and these desires that are in us? If we're not able to express them towards a spouse, or we're in a season with our spouse where we're just missing each other, our relationship isn't strong, we feel more like roommates than we do people that are married. We feel more like we're co-parenting rather than people that have joined together for a common purpose. What do we do with these passions and these desires? And so that's what I want to talk about. And what we do with those passions is we refocus those passions and those desires that cause us to inwardly burn. So the second angle we're going to come at is these mismanaged passions. Because in reality, a lot of us mismanage these passions. And I would say this is what causes a lot of the issues in our lives. It's really interesting that Paul uses the terminology burn. Because as you think about the word burn, you typically think about fire. Fire is an element that in itself is a good element. Fire is purifying. Fire gives heat. Fire gives light. Fire allows us to put raw meat on above it, and then we cook some really delicious things that we get to eat. Fire is a good thing. Sex is a good thing. Sex is a wonderful thing. There's a reason that God created it to feel good, because God designed it that way. It's something good that he wants a husband and a wife to experience in a relationship with one another. You see, but the church doesn't always teach that. What we teach is that sex is dirty, sex is bad, sex is sinful, sex is disgusting. Express it to your spouse. It's a good thing. But just like every other passion, when it's mismanaged, it can become damaging. You see, as I was thinking about this, you go back to Exodus, and there was a man named Moses. Many of you might be familiar with the story of Moses and the burning bush and his experience with the burning bush. However, 40 years before the burning bush, there was a significant event in Moses' life. Moses was a very, very passionate individual that God created. God placed a good passion in Moses. But just like every good passion, it needs to be managed in the correct way. because Moses expressed this manage in a poor way, and it was actually damaging to him. In Exodus chapter 2, in verse 11, and those of you that understand the story, maybe remember the story. If you don't, very simply, Moses was a Hebrew. He was actually a Jew who was brought up by an Egyptian family, and many believe that he was actually part of the royalty of the Egyptian royalty court. And so he's a Hebrew. He's brought up as an Egyptian, and so he almost had this status over the rest of the Hebrews and the Egyptians. And it says in chapter 2, verse 11, one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were, and he watched them at their hard labor. So he's conflicted. He's like, my people are working on behalf of the Egyptian kingdom, but I'm not doing this, and he's conflicted in himself. And remember, God placed a passion inside of him because God was going to use Moses in some great ways. In verse 11, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian. So his passion got the best of him. He killed the Egyptian and he hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? The man said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. Just because you bury something in the sand from your past doesn't mean it's not going to come back and bite you. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Moses had a good and pure passion for God's people. God had given Moses a beautiful, wonderful desire for his people. But yet Moses allowed it to be expressed in a damaging way. It's one thing to have the right passion, but it's another thing to express that right passion in the correct way. You know, the purpose for which God put in you can be a good thing, but can also prevent you from being really great if it's mismanaged. There is some phenomenal potential for the kingdom of God sitting right here in this room. But if we don't express our passions in the correct way, we're going to miss out on what God has called us to do. And even more than that, others are going to miss out on the blessings for which he wanted to give them through you because we couldn't control and manage our passions in the right way. See, a good thing or even a God thing expressed in the wrong way can become a bad thing. You see, passions, sex, desires, all of that are good things. What they need are parameters. If you're taking notes, I want you to write this phrase down. Boundaries are blessings. Boundaries are not created to control us, but boundaries are blessings. A lot of people will say, well, God and church, that's just all there just to control people, and that's how people control, and they use rules and regulations to do that. It completely misses the point. About 6 or 7 months ago, my wife and I, we moved our family from a neighboring town called Windsor to Fort Collins. We work primarily with athletes up and down the Front Range, and we're closer to Colorado State University where we do most of our ministry. And so we're closer, and we're in the county area. We're not in the city, we're in county. And so we moved to this property. It's about 1.25 acres, and it's a great property. We love it. But for the first 4 months, we didn't have a fence because the people before us didn't want to build a fence there. And so we thought, well, we got to get a fence. And then I realized you got to wait 3 or 4 months because fences are expensive. And if you're looking for a job, I'd say you start a fence company because they get paid a lot. So we had to wait a few months to save up the money to be able to buy this fence. We have an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 3-year-old. And we wanted them to enjoy the yard. We want them to enjoy the property. That's why we bought the property. We want them to enjoy it. There's a play set and a zip line, and it's a great, great property. But without a fence, it was pretty stressful because we'd let them go out and play, and we have this little window at our kitchen where we can kind of like see them play in the play set. And then we have a 2-year-old boxer and a 4-month-old lab at the time. And just taking them to the bathroom in a yard with no fence was terrifying for us, and it was incredibly stressful. So finally, after 4 months, we get a fence built. And do you know what? That fence has been an incredible blessing. And we didn't create that. We didn't buy that fence because we were mad at our kids. We didn't buy that fence because we want to control our kids. You know why we put that fence up? Because we wanted our children and our dogs and our friends and the students we have over at our house to explore and enjoy every square inch of that property. You see, boundaries are blessings in our lives. Boundaries actually give us freedom to do everything and anything we want within the boundaries, and that's what God has established when he created the covenant of marriage. And I was thinking about a way to illustrate this, and so what I thought about is I was gonna bring this firewood. I was gonna take this firewood right here, and I was just gonna put it on the stage, and then I thought about maybe I'll just bring some lighter fluid, and I'll light this on fire, and I'll create this fire right here on the stage. And then I thought to myself, I don't know, people might be mad, and they might freak out and start running towards the exits and trample each other. And then I also thought I'm Middle Eastern, so building a fire in a church in today's political climate might not be a good thing for the Middle Easterner to do. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist or someone that's incredibly versed in the science of fire to know that this is a bad idea. If I brought lighter fluid and if I lit this on fire, this is not a good idea. Why is it not a good idea? Because there's no boundaries. There's no parameters. There's nothing to contain this fire. Because if this fire is built and there's nothing to contain it, it's going to be damaging. It's not only going to be damaging to the stage, it's probably going to be damaging to my relationship with Doug. And it's also damaging because it could potentially burn this place down. This place that God has established for his great and wonderful purposes in the valley here in Castle Rock. You see, you cannot build a fire without parameters. But see, there's many of us in our lives, and in our thought lives, in our physical lives that are building fires in places they shouldn't be built. Outside of the marriage covenant, fire destroys. And it's bad, and it's terrible. And can I say this pretty boldly? If you're dating someone or you are someone that is not respecting the boundaries of marriage before you get married, what's going to make you think he or she is going to respect the boundaries of marriage after you get married? You see, if we put our passions in the wrong place, it can burn up our home. If we put our passions and start building a fire outside of what God established with nothing to contain it, it will burn you. So let's get to some good news, the more positive part of what we're talking about. I want to talk about some shameless solutions. What do we do with this fire and this burning and this passion that we have that might be outside of the marriage covenant? What do we do? Because here's the tendency, and preachers like me, we're incredibly guilty of this. The tendency is for me or us or married people or whoever is to take a bucket of ice and say, all you got to do is douse it. And we use shame to say it is a horrible thing that you even have this desire. How dare you have this? If you love God, why would you have this desire? Just put that desire out and then it's going to magically pop up again here, when it's time for it to pop up. That's not right. That's not even realistic. I could come here and I could use shame tactics to shame us out of, having this fire in our lives. And that'll last for about 3 days. And then a couple days later, the temptation will come or the thoughts will come back. And so what do we do? So we can't use shame because actually for the reality is, for a lot of us that struggle in this area, it's actually shame that drives us to utilizing sex and relationships in an unhealthy way. So shame can't be a solution for it. So what is the solution? And it's not as easy as me saying, you need to take this wood and put it back into the fire pit. That's one of the things. One of the realities is we need to start thinking about what fire am I fueling? What fire am I allowing myself to fuel? And I need to stop feeding that fire. We moved into our new place. My wife got me a grill, and I absolutely love grilling. I love smoking meat. It's one of my favorite hobbies, things to do, especially in the summer. Almost every weekend, I've got a different type of meat in the smoker, and I love it. And we have this little gas valve, many of you have as well, it's connected to our house. And my wife got me a gas start smoker. And I was like, no, I don't want that because I like to use real wood for the smoking of the meat. I want to use coals. I don't want it to just be a gas grill. And she said, oh, no. It's going to be real wood. It's going to be real fire, but you just use the fuel that comes from the house just to light it. And I thought, well, that's a great thing. Like, I need that. That's actually a great idea. Thank you. And so we got it installed. The problem is no one taught me how to use it. And so it's installed in our house, and so I'd never used one like that. I've always used charcoal or something like that. So I go and I turn the gas on, and I figured it was like a car. Like you leave it on, it warms up for a little bit, and I go back inside to get my meat, and I come back outside, and I brought it out, took the plastic off the ribs, and I'm about to put it on. Then I thought, well, I better light this thing on fire before I put the wood in there. And so my kids were playing out in the back, and I go and I put the match down. And can I tell you that when I give an altar call now, like I do it real passionately because I have seen the depths of hell fire when I lit that grill. I thought my eyebrows were gone. My son's like crying because he's terrified of fire. I mean, it was a terrible thing. And then I found out there's actually an order to this. No one told me this. You put the wood in first, you put the wood in the grill, and then you turn on the gas, and then you light the fire. You see, the order is really important. You see, but a lot of us are building fires outside of this container. A lot of us are not only building fires, we're fueling the fires. And may I just ask, and here's what I want to do. I want to say this boldly. As someone that loves you but really doesn't care what you think about me, but I really believe that this needs to be said. That some of us need to stop pouring fuel on fires that shouldn't be lit. Some of us need to stop sending those text messages. Some of us need to stop that relationship at work. Some of us need to stop getting on those websites. Some of us need to realize that we're fueling fires that don't need to even be lit, let alone be fueled. And yet we justify it. We say, well, it's just a little bit. It's just one little conversation. Makes me feel better. Just one little website. Just one relationship. Just one conversation. Can I tell you that you don't need a flamethrower to start a forest fire? A little spark can catch a forest on fire and cause thousands upon thousands of acres of damage. You see, the only thing powerful enough to contain this desire and passion of sexuality that God created, the only thing powerful enough to contain it is the covenant of marriage. Nothing else is powerful enough to contain this great and wonderful desire that God put in us. So what do we do when we're not married? What do we do when we crave that intimacy? What do we do when we're in a circumstance where we just absolutely we sense that we need to be with somebody? Can I encourage us to redirect that passion? It's not putting it out. I don't want to shame us into that. But in the season of our lives, can we redirect that passion for something else? For a passion that is just as powerful, for a passion that is just as wonderful, for a passion that meets God's standards and God's desire for our lives. And that's to redirect that passion for His purposes. So as we close here in a little bit, I want to talk about how do we redirect our passions for His purposes. There's a couple guideposts that I just wanted to share with us to help us consider how do we redirect these passions. First and foremost, conversations. Who are you talking to about these issues? Or maybe who are you talking to you shouldn't be talking to? I was walking in and I saw the next steps counter over here at Plum Creek, and I see some cards about some groups. Men, can I tell you that there's 6 different opportunities throughout the week, or 5 different opportunities throughout the week for you to connect with other men to talk about these issues? That there's a deepening the soul of your marriage group that is meeting. There's a relationship workshop series. There's healthy places to express these desires and express these conversations. Second and third, comparison. Who are you comparing yourself to? Imagination. What are you allowing to where do you allow your mind to go to? Because here's the reality, a lot of us are miserable in our relationships, and a lot of us are miserable because we're single, and a lot of us are miserable in our marriages because we've allowed comparison and imagination to run wild. And a lot of us are building fires outside of what we were intended to have the fire at. See, outside the fire is damaging. Inside the container, the fire is good. And we sit around and it warms us and we cook s'mores and it's wonderful and it's a beautiful place to contain that fire. But some of us are fueling fires that shouldn't be lit. And the fuel that we're using is comparison and imagination. And men, I'm in this category as well, so I want to say some of us are miserable because we have allowed an airbrushed image of a female on a magazine or a video to define what beauty truly is. Ladies, a lot of us are miserable because we read these stories in these books and we watch shows like The Bachelor that no man can, can I say this? No man can ever compare to taking a woman on a date on a network budget. Okay, like that just won't happen. We're miserable because we imagine and we compare and compare and compare. And our idea of beauty in relationships has been completely skewed. You see, not only do we crave intimacy, a lot of us have replaced intimacy for infatuation. And the root of the word infatuation, actually the Latin of that word is false fire. Something that looks like it's fire, but it's false. It looks like it'll heat us and warm us, but it won't. You see, I don't want to shame us, but I want to talk real about what to do with these passions. See, we're going to close here in a few minutes, and we're going to receive communion. I'm going to ask the ushers to distribute those communion elements, and if you would, just hold on to them, and we'll take communion together. Moses, 40 years after this incident where he buried the Egyptian that he killed, and he mismanaged his passion, Moses had another encounter with passion and fire and drive. Exodus chapter 3, it says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian." Now tell me that's not a great word for someone who's single here today. That Moses was tending the flock that God had given him. Moses was doing what God had put in him to do. Moses was fulfilling the purpose for which God had placed him in this world to do. And we're going to see in a moment that as Moses is doing what God has called him to do, he encounters our holy God. He led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, "I will go over and see the strange sight, why this bush does not burn up." Friends, God has a passion and a fire that he wants us to experience that never runs dry. That God has a purpose and a passion and a desire that he wants us to pursue, and it will never, ever run dry. Anyone can set a bush on fire and it burn up, but only God can fuel a fire that never runs out. I understand that the passion and desire of sexuality is a strong one. The passion and desire of relationship and intimacy is a powerful one. And I don't want to minimize that fire. And I pray that in some way, shape, or form, God reveals to you the purposes for which he placed you on this earth. Your purpose is not to be a spouse. Your purpose is to do what God has called you to do. So I pray you discover it. So if you're in the season and you have the gift of singleness, I pray that you pursue those passions and those purposes that God places in you. It's almost as if we fight the fire of lust and desire and passions and intimacy, the things that we want, that we fight that fire with the fire that never burns out of pursuing God's purposes for our lives.